That is a great question. And so actually I have like a whole bunch of people that come to my mind with my teen years, and just some guys who are just extremely influential in my development as a young man, as a believer in Jesus, and how to like just live all that out. I could think of youth leaders, I could think of my youth pastor. So I'm just going to try to narrow it down to just two today, actually. So one, firstly, is a youth leader, and then I'm going to talk about my youth pastor growing up as well. So first of all, this youth leader I'm thinking of, his name is Cody, and he grew up not knowing Jesus, and just watching his transformation, the transformation that Jesus made in his life, and watching him walk through that and then grow into a mature young adult who is just pursuing the Lord, was just so appealing to a young guy. And so I watched this, and he was a youth leader at the time and a young adult and serving in the church. And over time, we became friends, and he just took me under his wing and just spent years just mentoring me and discipling me. And yeah, it was really, really important for me to have someone like that in my life. And it was as simple as just watching how he lived his life and then saying, that's a man of God. I wanna live like that. And as simple as that, but also as intentional as sitting down and having Bible studies and working through like really practical stuff from God's word and how to apply that to my life. And so that's one guy, Cody Osask, just an absolutely phenomenal guy, down to earth. Like I said, came from a rough background, but the transformation that God put in his life, part of that was so that he could be salt and light to others and point them to Christ. And then there's my youth pastor, Pastor Gary. I still call him Pastor Gary, even though I'm in my 30s now. He's living out in PEI now. He came on staff in Winnipeg, where my dad was pastoring, when I was about in grade 6. And from grade 6 all the way through graduation, then all the way into giving Stephanie and me premarital counseling, he was my guy. He was my youth pastor, and as I became an adult, a friend, and an absolute just huge ministry in my life. And yeah, I just remember so many just formative times growing up, doing stupid things like teenagers tend to do. And because of the nature of our sinful heart, there's temptations here and temptations there. And he was just so gracious and so consistent. And the longevity of his ministry in Winnipeg was amazing. Like I said, grade 6 all the way till my early 20s. And he was there through all of it, all the highs, all the lows. And God used Pastor Gary in just a phenomenal way. And I would say that because of his ministry, I would attribute a lot of that to just a huge reason to why I'm doing what I do today, as well as my wife, and just how it just sort of shaped our future. And obviously God is sovereign over all of that. And I'm just so thankful that God used him and his wife Trisha and their kids. And yeah, so thank you, Pastor Gary and Cody, and the many others who are just formative, people in my life to point me to Jesus. And my charge to myself now, as a young man, and to teenagers and to everybody, is have people in your life that intentionally are speaking into your life. And if you're in a stage in your life where you need to be that person, then be that person. Don't be afraid of it. God has given us all gifts, and so I think that every person needs to be mentored by somebody and mentoring somebody. And so if you're not in that zone, I encourage you to pray through that and get into that zone, because God will really use it. And I think it's the way that he has created us, to put people around us who point us ultimately to him and to his glory, so that we can live lives that just shine Jesus. So yeah, thank you to those guys.
So for me, when I think back to a youth leader that influenced me, I have to answer the question, I have to give a bit of context, I guess. When I was young, I was part of a pack of young guys in the church, and people weren't exactly lining up for the opportunity to serve us in Sunday school. In fact, when I was going to go into youth group for the first time, they changed the age up to the next grade, and then they did the same thing the next year. And as far as my recollection is, I was not that bad, but together as a pack, we weren't that great. Anyhow, so when I think of youth leaders, I typically think of guys that taught Sunday school when I was a young person or led our youth group, and think of people who tried really hard, for which I appreciate. But I think for me, the two big influences in my life that to this day I'm grateful to God for. One is a gentleman named Mel Slack. In the church I grew up in, I was just talking with Andrew a little bit, I have a lot of questions about our church. It was one of those churches, we were downtown Calgary, big flagship church, sold the building on 7th Avenue, moved to the southwest of Calgary, built a big building, 1,000-seat auditorium, dedicated dining room, gym, Christian education wing. And I was young enough when we moved to appreciate all that we had there. And the other thing I recognized when I was growing up in that newer facility is there was something wrong, and I couldn't tell you what it was, but I could see the effects of it. So growing up, I really struggled to understand why we worshiped a great and awesome and all-powerful God at the same time while our church was slowly bleeding out. So that was a question I really struggled with. But for me, there was one man, Mel Slack, who he started his own mission, Venture Teams International. He would take young people all over the world, I think often to India, train them, disciple them, and then put them into ministry situations. And he would come to our church and report, probably, I'm guessing, once every 6 months kind of thing. And what I remember of Mel is nothing of what he said, but he was one of those people that, to me, and I've never really asked a question of other people that grew up with me and my church, to me, he embodied what it meant to be a Christian man. And I can't tell you what he ever preached on, but I can tell you that whatever he preached on, he really believed it. And I can tell you he was a man that greatly loved Jesus. And I think for me, growing up, seeing the struggles in our church, seeing the picture of real faith lived out in a person was really important to me. I needed a picture of what it meant to follow Jesus, and he was that picture to me. And it's interesting, years later, I think I probably would have been in my late 20s, early 30s, I had a nudge from the Holy Spirit just to write him a note, and I wrote him a note, and I think he was absolutely shocked at what I told him about the impact he had on my life. But I'm just telling you this story just to encourage you. Like, it's not a great example of discipleship, but it is the power of a well-lived life, even beyond where we might expect it to impact people. Just seeing it from a distance was powerfully life-changing for me. And then the other thing I would say is not so much a person, but a place. For me, the first place I really ever was challenged as a believer was at Camp Chestermere. And I remember our CIT leader telling us things like, you should read the Bible. Here's some verses for you to memorize, and here's some ministry opportunity, and you have this problem, why don't you pray about it? And at camp, our director, Jerry Robinson, and all these leaders just poured into our young lives, and it was just a remarkable place for me where I was pushed in my faith, given opportunity, and I had a real chance to see the Lord at work and see him for myself answer real prayers that I prayed. So not so much a single person, but a gentleman that I watched from a distance for a long time who impacted me, and then a place, Camp Chestermere, where every year people poured into me. I had a chance to pour into others, and God really worked. So those are kind of my two places. Thanks.
So someone who's been especially just influential in my life is actually a guy from college. I've had quite a few youth leaders and youth pastors that have been influential in my life, but one guy that's really stuck out, his name is Mr. Newton from Miller College in Saskatchewan. So I actually met him at a soccer tryout. He's the school president and also the soccer coach. Well, he's not the coach anymore, but he used to be. But yeah, the first thing I kind of knew about him was that he was a super hard worker and wouldn't expect anything less from us. I know at least one guy threw up during his first tryout for soccer, but before we even started, he brought us all together and just explained that although soccer and skill and just dedication to the sport was important, what was even more important was our character and how we acted on the field and off the field, because we knew we'd be playing teams that weren't all Christian, and it was more important to him to have good character than skill. So in my third year, I actually asked him to be my mentor as part of Miller's program, you have a mentor each year. So I asked him to be my mentor for that year. And a few things that I knew about him were his humility and his servant heart. It was known to see him washing dishes with the students, and he'd always be out there doing the dirtiest jobs with us. And just his humility was pretty cool to me, because he was the president of the school but would never flaunt that. And every morning you'd see him in his office early, and I know on at least one occasion when I went to meet him, his stomach would have been rumbling. It was because he was fasting. He was just about as humble, as genuine person as I could think as I've ever met. But he also just cared about all the students, and you could just tell he cared about me when we met, despite having a bunch of decisions and just other roles he had to fulfill as the president. Whenever we met, he was fully there and fully just listening. And just the advice he would give was super helpful. It was always being obedient to the Lord and not overcomplicating things, which I think is just something that's super easy for me to do. One verse that just really sticks out to me when I think about him is Matthew 20, verse 26, which says, "But whoever would be great among you must be your servant." And I think that's just something that really characterized his role as the president there and his role as my mentor for that year, and something I'll always remember and look up to, and hopefully be able to somewhat replicate. I just really appreciated his effort and the time he put into answering my questions and just setting an example of what living a life for Jesus should look like.
Yeah, and thinking of just some youth leaders that influenced me. I never would have had a youth pastor growing up. It wouldn't be very common in Ireland to have a youth pastor. But I can think of two brothers. And so this is, if you think about whenever I was probably 11 or 12, Sunday morning at Sunday school, one brother would have been my teacher, I think, while I was 11 or 12. And then whenever I graduated from Sunday school, then I was also now the age to go to youth group. And so his brother then became my youth group leader. So Trevor would have been my Sunday school teacher, and then Lawrence, his brother, would have been my youth group leader, not for very long, just for a couple of years. But I think one thing that I really appreciate about both brothers was their Bible knowledge. They were just faithful, and just sort of how they applied the Bible story or the Bible lesson. And then their patience with us. It would not have been easy to teach my Sunday school class, and then that group that went into youth wouldn't have been the easiest group to teach, and yet their patience with us. And it's funny because you wouldn't describe them, like whenever I think of sort of the North American, the Canadian model of youth pastor that's that high energy, fun, just really gets down on your level, kind of like Pastor Tyler, who's really good at it. Whenever I think of that model, both these brothers were neither like that at all. They were very sort of straight-faced, very serious, but I was just encouraged by just their faithfulness and influenced by their faithfulness. And so I think, like some of the other guys have said, I hope this is an encouragement. Just if you're either a Sunday school teacher or a youth sponsor, or even involved maybe with one of the other ministries, just don't minimize the impact that you can have on the lives of those who are watching you, because I don't think those guys would have realized how much I was watching them. They probably would have thought that I really didn't have a lot of time for them, but just the impact of their patience, the impact of their care and their love for me and for other youth groups / Sunday school kids was just clear. And so I appreciated their genuineness. And so, yeah, I hope that's an encouragement, even as I think of the impact they had on me. So thanks to those guys.
Well, I have lots of people I could pick from when I'm answering sort of a youth pastor, youth leader who made a big impact. I had the privilege of sitting under lots of great youth pastors. In fact, Pastor Dave, who's on our staff, I interned under. He was a youth pastor at the time, so I wasn't like in a youth group, but certainly he had a huge influence. But one name that always comes to mind when I think of people who had an impact, and it's sort of ironic because I would guess he probably wouldn't even realize the kind of impact he had, was a guy by the name of Michel Tremblay. I was in grade 8 in sort of early junior high youth group, and he was a youth sponsor. He was a fairly new Christian himself, was in the Canadian Armed Forces. We lived in Ontario at the time, so he had come from Quebec and was at Base Borden, near where we lived, and he was our youth leader in the group. I honestly don't remember a ton about him. The two stories that come to mind are the time he picked up one of my friends and threw him over a fence and ripped a very expensive sweatshirt. I don't know exactly why that stands out in mind, but I do remember that. And I also remember that he took us to Base Borden and sat us in this really cool little theater and showed us videos of like the latest jet fighters that Canada was looking at purchasing. That definitely stood out in the mind of a grade 8 kid. But the thing that really impacted me faith-wise was just the genuine sincerity of his love for Jesus and his love for us. And at that point in my life, that was a huge impact. And I'm not saying others didn't share that, but it wasn't that Michel had all the answers. I'm sure he felt very underqualified to even be a youth leader, but he loved Jesus and he loved us, and he wasn't afraid to show it and just kind of invest himself in our lives. And that has stood with me all these years. Probably he was really only a part of my life for maybe about 6 months, but I've never forgotten him. I've tried to find him over the years to thank him, but I've lost touch of him, with him. But there's a verse in 2 Timothy that every time I read it, it reminds me of Michel, and so I'll share it with you. Paul's writing to Timothy and says, "I'm reminded of your sincere faith, a faith that dwelt first in your grandmother Lois and your mother Eunice, and now I'm sure dwells in you as well." Paul uses the same word over in 1 Timothy chapter 1, verse 5, that sincere faith. And Michel was a man that just had a sincere faith. And that, I think, impacted a whole bunch of us guys who he played a part in our lives. So that's the guy who comes to mind when I think of someone who had an impact in my life, Michel Tremblay from Quebec. And the takeaway for me is don't ever be afraid to serve, even if you maybe feel underqualified, because the sincerity of your faith, your love for Jesus, and your love for people, it will make a difference.